And with that, journalist and academic Anatol Lieven is a professor at Georgetown University in Qatar, which, if you're doing the math, means he is checking in tonight from exactly 11 hours into the future. And we're grateful to him for making this a priority so early in the morning. But at any rate, he's posted at Qatar with Georgetown University. He's a fellow of the New America Foundation. He's been a British journalist or worked as a British journalist in Pakistan, Afghanistan, the former USSR, and in Eastern Europe. In a subsequent career in the academy, Dr. Lieven's areas of expertise include insurgency and counterinsurgency, terrorism, Islamist movements, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Russia, and the former Soviet Union, US political culture and strategy. He has spoken as an expert to the British Parliament, US Congress, and the French Foreign Ministry, as well as many universities and institutes. From 2000 to 2005, he was a senior associate for foreign and security policy at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's commented on current affairs for academic journals and periodicals, including the New York Review of Books, Prospect, The Nation, and many more. And he's the author of, by my count, at least 7 published books, including The Baltic Revolution, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Path to Independence, which won both the George Orwell Prize for Political Reporting and the Yale University Press Governor's Award back in 1993. America, Right or Wrong, Anatomy of American Nationalism, published in 2004, and Pakistan, A Hard Country from 2011. His latest book is Climate Change and the Nation State, The Case for Nationalism in a Warming World, and it's the subject of this evening's talk. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anatol Lieven.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm most grateful for this chance to talk. As I suppose the introduction brings out, I'm a rather unusual recruit to the camp of climate change action. I often tell my students, having been a journalist and covered so many of the parts of the world, I can teach them everything except marriage and car maintenance. Now, what this book really is an attempt to bring together the experiences and the lessons of my professional career to date and apply them to what I take to be by far the greatest threat facing not just the world in general, but the West, including my country, Britain, and the United States in the generations and centuries to come, which is climate change. And what my book is at heart, an attempt to apply the principles of realism to the issue of climate change action. I come from the realist tradition in international relations. I hope to say the ethical realist tradition. I wrote a book with this subject as influenced by the Christian realism of Reinhold Niebuhr. So I tried to distinguish that from the harsher and crueler realism of somebody like Henry Kissinger, for example. But still, I come from the realist tradition, which emphasizes, as Hans Morgenthau said, the centrality of state interest expressed through power, states as central to whatever happens in the world. And in the book, I have 2 main target audiences. The first is policymakers and my colleagues in the foreign and security policy community, who I believe have grossly underestimated the danger of climate change compared to other classical, traditional, but in fact much smaller threats to the West. And secondly, to certain parts of the environmental activist camp, who I believe have failed to show political realism when it comes to addressing both the questions of practical action against climate change, but also how to create political consensus or political majorities behind climate change action. Because one of the themes of the book is that, like it or not, to take serious action, and especially, of course, serious action in good time to limit climate change, will require sacrifices. And well, I hardly need to tell you in Washington State after the last 2 plebiscites, how very, very difficult it is to get people to agree to make sacrifices for the sake of climate change action. So the question is how to convince people that sacrifice is legitimate and necessary. My own trajectory to climate change action was influenced, I suppose, above all by three things. The first, like everybody else, simply by the evidence. I'm not, of course, a scientist, but as on every other issue, I accept the scientific consensus unless I can see really, really strong reasons not to do so. And the scientific consensus on the issue of climate change is overwhelming. Not, of course, when it comes to the precise details and timing of what's going to happen in future. It would be wrong, very wrong, to be precise about that. But the scale of the danger, the reality of what is happening, and of course the fact that to date we have fallen drastically short of the necessary action to limit climate change. So that is the first one. The second thing that really brought me to awareness of this issue, and awareness also of the imminent danger in historical terms of this issue, was the fact that I have spent quite a lot of time in South Asia, first as a student and a freelance journalist in India, then as a journalist in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and then once again after 2001, back in Pakistan and Afghanistan as a researcher. And my book on Pakistan is, I think I can say, the first book by a political and security analyst of Pakistan, which puts climate change front and center. Because after all this time spent in South Asia, I have become aware of just how endangered South Asian societies are already by water shortages in particular, environmental degradation, and the threat of flooding in coastal areas, and how climate change can, I mean, actually in this case, well within the lifetimes of people alive today, bring about regional catastrophe and the collapse of these states. So that's the second reason. The third reason is a deeper historical one. I was trained as a historian before becoming a journalist, and I'm haunted by the image of 1914 in Europe. The great powers of Europe, their ruling elites, all absolutely convinced that the greatest threat to European states was from each other. Russia was obsessed with the threat from Germany. Germany was obsessed with the threat from Russia. Austria, of course, France obsessed with traditional rivalry with Germany. Germany and England at odds over, frankly, utterly worthless colonies in Africa. And all of them miss the fact that the real threats to these states and to European civilizations were not from each other. In fact, they shared the European elites shared the great majority of interests, the great majority of culture. No, the great threats to European civilization were from within, from revolt by discontented masses following barbarous and totalitarian ideologies. And of course, these revolutions were enabled by the First World War, into which the great powers of Europe plunged because of this unnecessary rivalry between them. And so this book is a very, very strong argument against this push now in the American and British also foreign policy establishments for a new Cold War with China, and also for the, to me, tremendous exaggeration of the Russian threat and the Iranian threat in international affairs. Now, you know, I do not like any of these regimes, and I, of course, know that in certain ways, you know, they are dangerous for their regions and the world. However, I believe that compared to climate change, these issues are really of secondary importance. So the book is really an appeal to prioritize, to see climate change as the greatest threat, not only to humanity in general and the world in general, but also specifically to the USA, the American state and Western states. It's written, if you like, in my imagination, from the standpoint of a historian writing 200 years from now. And as I say in the book, just as today, almost 110 years later, we look back at the great powers of Europe, their rulers, and we basically, historians say, how can they have been so stupid as to do this? And I have a really strong sense that, you know, if we fail to take timely action against climate change, that is what the historians 200 years from now will say of us. How can they have been so stupid? And for me, a kind of moment of revelation was when thinking about these sandbanks and reefs in the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands, which currently, of course, they obsess the Chinese security community, and the Chinese occupation of these reefs and sandbanks has become, you know, an enormous obsession of American policymakers, and has largely driven the militarization of US policy in the Far East, the so-called pivot to Asia, and the tremendous deployment of American resources, American money, American action in this region. But the point is, these are reefs and sandbanks. They're not even islands. If we continue on present trajectories, they will be totally irrelevant 100 years or so from now, because they will all be underwater again. Now, this, of course, is an argument against the Chinese pouring concrete and sand into the sea. But you could say it's also an argument for America to sit back and applaud the Chinese doing this. Please go on with it. You know, you want to pour money into the, literally throw money into the sea, go ahead. You know, in the long run, it doesn't threaten us or anybody else because of climate change. So the first part of the book is directed at the foreign and security community, and it's based on the realist concentration on states, but with a different twist, which is that in the end, something which is, I fear, generally forgotten by now in the State Department and in the Pentagon, states exist to protect and advance the lives and the interests of their citizens. The interests of US citizens come first. The interests of US citizens are not, in the end, directly threatened, or in some cases threatened at all, by what happens in many parts of the world. And the Washington establishment is not actually, in the end, pursuing the interests of ordinary Americans in these parts of the world. It's pursuing American primacy, as it's called in Washington, or hegemony, as it's called elsewhere, which may sometimes be in the interests of certain parts of the world, but is often completely irrelevant to the interests of ordinary Americans, which are, of course, focused in the short term on their economic condition, the conditions of their lives, but I believe in the longer term will be heavily shaped by what happens with climate change. So I want to try to help convince, add my voice to those saying that, you know, America really needs to concentrate on, you know, what helps ordinary Americans, rather than the pursuit of power in parts of the world often irrelevant to the United States. And from that point of view, the book was written before the pandemic, but the updated paperback edition is coming out this year. And I argue in the updated edition that the pandemic does, I believe, bring out several of my key points. The first, of course, tragically, is that while Russia, China have not killed a single American over the past 50 years, to the best of my knowledge, perhaps a couple of agents. The coronavirus has already killed, or is not quite already, but is well on its way to killing more Americans than died in the First and Second World Wars put together. The human casualties dwarf recent American foreign policy intervention, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, dwarf them by orders of magnitude. And in future, the health effects, as well as the economic effects of climate change will do the same if the general scientific analyses and projections are correct. So the pandemic should have been a terrifying warning of the power of natural forces to disrupt our lives and our limited capacity to manage them. The fact that, you know, we can suffer terrible damage out of left field, as it were. Some things for which, you know, our governing establishments were dreadfully unprepared. And what I argue in this section is that we need to prioritize. One of the reasons why they were unprepared for the pandemic, one of the reasons why we are paying far too little attention, spending far too few resources in the struggle to limit climate change, is that we are paying far too much attention and spending far too many resources on the military and economic support of American and to some extent Western global hegemony. Now, as far as the direct physical effects of climate change on the USA and Northern Europe at least are concerned, these will probably for a considerable time to come, not a great time in historical terms, but a considerable time in human terms, decades, some generations perhaps, be limited. Unless, of course, we hit a tipping point, release of methane from the Arctic permafrost, for example, earlier than is mostly predicted today. And then, of course, things could go to hell very quickly. And then every country in the world will be in mortal danger. But failing that, the tipping points are a very dreadful danger, an apocalyptic danger if we can't limit climate change, but they may be further ahead. In the shorter term, the direct physical effects are likely to be manageable, in my view, for the USA. But, and this is where my experience of South Asia really comes in other parts of the world, West Africa, South Asia, the direct effects are going to come in much earlier. Because, of course, in terms of temperature, in terms of water supplies, these areas are, in terms of overpopulation, these areas are already under considerable stress, which climate change is bound to make worse. And in the book, I talk at length about a series of reports by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, pointing out that a fairly limited rise in what are called wet bulb temperature, in other words, the combination of heat and humidity, would make outdoor work literally fatal in the Gulf, where I now live, and in South Asia for periods of time. This would, of course, have a terrible effect on human health, but it would also have a dreadful effect on agriculture. Then there is the fact that relatively limited rises in temperature in these areas will lead to drastic reductions in food productivity, grain, rice. If there are sustained temperatures of over 40 degrees over a period of months, then rice cultivation collapses. If rice cultivation collapses in South Asia, you're going to have a lot of starving people. And the World Bank predicts that because of this combination of effects, by the year 2050, Indian economic growth will essentially have gone into reverse, and hundreds of millions of Indians will be, from their present aspiring position, aspiring to middle-class living standards, will be sinking into deep poverty again, with obviously apart from the human consequences, catastrophic consequences for Indian political stability. Now, as I tell my students, I'm unlikely to be around by then, but my Indian and South Asian students will only be middle-aged when this happens. So the entire Indian dream of India shining, but also the US hope of India as a key ally, obviously a key economically successful, politically stable ally in Asia, will start to collapse really quickly, within a generation or so, if these analyses are correct. And what I say in the book is that in the West, we will not be immune to these effects, above all because of, the effects on the world economy as a whole, of course, but also the effects on migration. People do not stay to starve or drown in the case of Bangladesh, they move. And we already have seen, I think, the ability of even much more limited levels of mass migration to produce pretty radical destabilization of Western democracies and pressures in the direction of political extremism. So this, I think, is a threat that we have to take very, very seriously. Incidentally, in the first instance, the danger of greatly increased migration is not to the West, although that's what we concentrate on. It's in fact to countries in the regions themselves, partly for Hindu nationalist reasons, but also for good economic ones. The most ferociously patrolled anti-immigrant border in the world is between India and Bangladesh. More than 1,100 people shot, killed on that border by Indian border forces over the past decade, because of course the Indians are extremely worried about Bangladeshi migration, and of course increased migration in future if sea levels rise. So the threat of migration to Western democracies and the world in general. Now, the other reason why the argument of the book is directed particularly at Western militaries and security establishments is their political role, both in terms of the redeployment of resources, but this leads to the second part of the book, which is the question of how to mobilize large majorities in the West, but also actually in other parts of the world as well, behind action against climate change and behind the sacrifices necessary. And my argument here is that to do this, it's not enough to gain small majorities. It will be necessary to create what is sometimes called new political dispensations, kind of thing that Franklin Delano Roosevelt achieved with the New Deal in the 1930s, and Ronald Reagan, I would say, unfortunately, achieved in the 1980s. That is to say, new consensuses in national affairs, which means that in the succeeding generations, Republican presidents, Eisenhower, Nixon, governed like New Deal Democrats. Centrist Democrats, Clinton, Obama, governed like Reaganites, in effect. And to do this, to get really a new national dispensation behind the Green New Deal, which is something I very strongly support, you need sweeping electoral majorities, really large electoral majorities of the kind achieved by Roosevelt and by Reagan. And the question, at that point, the question becomes, how do you appeal to, in many, often of course, former Social Democrat voters in Europe, Democrat voters in America who have gone over to the Republican Party, a Republican Party which is now unfortunately nailed culturally, not really in terms of serious analysis, to denial of climate change and refusal of climate change action. And this brings me to the next part of my argument, which is the argument that to win these voters back, you have to appeal to them through people who they respect, but also in terms that they understand. And this brings me to the issue of nationalism, or patriotism, to give it a nicer sounding American name. Of course, civic nationalism is what I support, not ethnic nationalism, obviously, a catastrophic course for America and the world. So I argue that it's necessary to convince this kind of voter that climate change is not just a threat to humanity in general, which it is, to the world in general, but is also a threat to America and other countries, to states and the future of states. Why I think nationalism also plays an important role in this regard is that, as has so often been said, an absolutely critical barrier to action against climate change is the fact that you're basically asking existing generations to make sacrifices to prevent harm that will only really kick in a really, really bad way in future generations after most of them are dead. And that has been a tremendous obstacle. And you've had all these efforts, discounting, what are the lives of people 50 years or 100 years from now worth compared to people today? And you sometimes, effectively end up with, if you listen to The Economist, with the principle that the future doesn't matter at all, to hell with it. The point, though, about nationalism or patriotism is that the nation exists in time. It is by definition something which has existed in the past and is intended to exist long into the future. As I point out, the Great Seal of the United States does not say, wow, the American Constitution is so like 10 minutes ago. It says novus ordo seclorum, a new order for the ages. In other words, America is the bearer of ideas which are supposed to last and influence the world through time, through long periods of time. And so I would like to use nationalism to focus people on the threat. Indeed, if we continue on present courses, the inevitability that America, the American nation, the bearer of these great ideals, will in fact cease to exist before the world is very much older. So that is the second argument from nationalism: political appeal and sacrifice for the future. So I'm running out of time, but so I'll speed up a bit on the last bit. Another reason why I focus on the issue of patriotism of states is, and this has really been reinforced by the pandemic as well, is twofold. The first is responsibility. It is very difficult to pin down governments to responsibility for the world in general. You can, to some extent, pin them down for what happens to their own country. So it's a question of nailing down responsibility. But the other thing is, as a realist speaking, but I think the pandemic has also really taught us this lesson, that states remain absolutely central to any effective action in the world. Now, in the book, I express my full support for international movements, for international cooperation on climate change, for international treaties like the Paris Agreement. They're all absolutely necessary, as is the work of the UN-backed international intergovernmental panel on climate change. But all of these things exist in the end to get states to act, to pressure, embarrass state governments and legislatures, and they exist, to take action. I think what the pandemic has shown yet again is that if you want to get things done in the world, it is states that will do it. And so the book is also a critique of those sections of the environmentalist community who have argued, as in so many of the books I read as part of research for this book, that in order to carry out serious action against climate change, states have to decline, states have to be replaced by international governance. That is not going to happen. Look around the world. I mean, anyone who looks not just at China, at Russia, at India, but actually at America as well. Anyone who thinks the American political establishment is going to surrender real power to international institutions, forgive me, but hasn't worked in the Washington policy world. It's not going to happen. The question is how to mobilize states to take serious action. And once again, in the pandemic, it was states that had to act. So finally, the last part of the book is a strong argument in favor of the Green New Deal idea. I didn't say this in the book, but Elizabeth Warren was my candidate for president. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, as we all know. It consists of an argument that the Green New Deal is obviously necessary against climate change, but that the only way to legitimize sacrifice in the cause of action against climate change is if those sacrifices are, at least to some extent, shared throughout society, including by the rich, and if they are accompanied by really strongly reinforced measures of social solidarity. But in the last part of the book, I also critique parts of the green community for political unrealism, both adding on to the issue of action against climate change, questions which are quite extraneous, not just extraneous and irrelevant, but in their utopian unrealism, actually only hinder the cause of climate change action and give comfort and support and arguments to the deniers and opposers of climate change action. So I call for a Green New Deal intended to create a new sweeping majority behind climate change action of the sort which I believe is urgently necessary if future disaster is to be prevented. Disaster not just the world in general, but disaster also to our own countries. Thank you. So that concludes my remarks. And now,
thank you so much. So we're going to move now to audience Q&A. So if you're watching in Crowdcast, you can submit your questions down below in the Ask a Question button. If you're watching on YouTube, we'll be keeping an eye on the chat over there as well, and you can submit your questions. So while we're waiting for questions to come in, I did want to just touch on your endpoint here on the Green New Deal. And are there politicians out there that sort of echo this view, senators, governors, et cetera, that you think might be swayed to climate action via nationalism, and sort of any tactics that we as citizens can use nationalism to fight climate change? And I have a tie-in to that at the end as well, once you've answered those.
I'm not sure, to be honest, except in a very few, limited number of cases, that there's much point in appealing to Republican senators and congressmen. I mean, maybe that is beginning to shift a bit as a result of, the reaction against Trump. But like everybody else, I'm sure I have been, extremely disappointed, not just by, the lack of a real backlash against Trump. But also simply, for, well, almost 30 years now, the complete failure of effort after effort by Clinton. I've been reading Obama's memoirs. On the most pragmatic, what should have been in the past completely consensual issues of policy, the total failure of efforts to reach out to the Republican political elites. So no, I don't attach much importance to that. My argument is a different one, which is that if the climate denial camp and the camp of opposition to climate change action are to be pushed back, you've got to win over their voters. It's winning voters that my argument is about. And I make the point that although thank God Biden won this election and the Democrats squeaked through to a Senate victory, I mean, obviously this is far, far, far less in electoral terms than was hoped for, and far less, frankly, than should have been achieved, given a candidate as, utterly chaotic failure. I mean, apart from all the other aspects as Donald Trump. So it's a question of how you can win enough voters to create this new political dispensation behind the Green New Deal. So that's what it's to them that my argument is directed.
Okay. And so my next question kind of ties into, we have an audience question from Carrie here. What do you think of the Biden administration's first few weeks? What do you think of the Biden administration's first few weeks of action? Is he doing enough? What would you like to see him do? And just kind of, thoughts on the Biden administration and their plan to tackle climate change. You mentioned, Elizabeth Warren didn't win, but hopefully there can be some implementation of what she was planning and Green New Deal and all of that.
Well, I mean, obviously, the Biden administration has already taken some extremely good actions. The Democratic establishment has moved on tremendously compared to even 2 years ago. When I was writing the book, when you may remember Nancy Pelosi dismissed, it as the Green New whatever, and so forth. There is now much more real commitment. But of course, as we all know, I mean, and this is what Obama was forced back on, so far it's all had to be by executive action. Some of the executive actions could have gone further. Like many people, I'm not happy with the, with the extension of fracking, with the failure to make much stronger statements about, moving away from oil in particular. But in the end, for, of course, truly radical action and the mobilization of the financial resources behind it, you have to have a majority in the Senate. Of course, as we all know, the fact that the Democrats only have a 1-seat majority, even if you include the vice president, means that huge amounts of power are handed to not so much to Republican moderates, but of course to one particular senator, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Democrat, conservative Democrat. And my fear is that will, along with all of the horse trading and special interests, which are now, which are built into congressional politics in the United States, will make really, really serious action extremely difficult. I hope that won't be the case, but if the Biden administration is restricted simply to executive action, then that will obviously be much more limited. Just, I mean, two things from the point of view of the book that I would add on that. I mean, one is that I hope that it may be possible to, and there are certain signs of this, to direct rivalry with China, away from military rivalry, away from these commitments to defend places in East Asia that may simply not be defensible, apart from anything else, away from committing America to territorial disputes, in which in some cases, by the way, the issue of right and wrong and legality is very, very mixed, and in which America, if you look at the border dispute between India and China, has no national stake whatsoever. But if, I do find this idea of the Sputnik moment and the space race quite an interesting one from this point of view. If one could redirect this to peaceful competition with China over the development of green technology, of alternative energy, electric cars, which is, by the way, very much the way they see it in China. This is seen by the Chinese establishment as a key part of competition with the United States and aiming for future Chinese global leadership, if you will. Now, if we could redirect the rivalry with China into those courses, then perhaps this geopolitical rivalry would not be so damaging. But the other thing I'd like to say about the Biden administration is that really almost a day after he appointed John Kerry as his climate change tsar, you began to get pieces put out by the Brookings, in all the usual places, foreign affairs, foreign policy, saying, oh, we mustn't allow climate change to become a priority in dealing with China. Of course, it's important, kind of, yes, a bit, but no, the priority must be geopolitical struggle, military rivalry, and all these things. And frankly, if that is that is the meaning of priority, if that's going to be American priority, then, or the Biden administration priority, then climate change is not going to be a priority. It's going to be a secondary issue. So that's my fear.
Thank you for that. So our next question comes from Hannah, and Hannah asks, in your argument, how do you balance nationalism with the move toward isolationism or populism that was so prevalent in the Trump era?
Well, I have a somewhat mixed attitude to isolationism. Partly, of course, it's a pejorative word, which is not is not wholly accurate. I mean, Trump was not, in fact, an isolationist. As we see, he was absolutely committed to American military power in so many parts of the world. You could say I'm an isolationist in the sense, as I said in my remarks, that I really believe that America should refocus on the interests of its own citizens rather than fooling around, spending enormous resources, running enormous risks for the sake of geopolitical global domination, which is not, in fact, usually in the interests of ordinary Americans. At least many of its aspects aren't. But more generally, in the area of climate change, a focus on the national interest and the long-term national survival of the United States does not in any way contradict American cooperation on climate change. It doesn't indicate, America simply withdrawing into itself and telling the rest of the world to go to hell. On the contrary, I mean, what it is that America focuses on what not China and not Russia, but the planet itself will do to harm, is already doing to harm parts of America. Forest fires, drought, hurricanes, and the terrible damage that the planet will do to America in future, if we go on in effect tormenting the planet in certain ways. So it's focused on America, on the defense of America, but not in ways, not in Trumpian ways or ways that indicate hostility to the outside world.
Thank you. So our next question comes from Mark, and Mark asks, or he says he's not normally a pessimist, but he thinks that nations will fail to proceed to begin to deal with climate change until we enter climate crisis. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, first of all, by most normal standards, we already are in a climate crisis. It hasn't, as I say, really bitten so deeply in America now. And the problem is, of course, that it's very difficult to make the absolutely firm and clear direct connection between climate change and some of the things that's happening. But I mean, it seems to me that logically, there is no way that one can deny the fact that the whole succession of record temperatures in recent years and their effects on forest fires, for example, on drought, is heavily influenced by climate change. I mean, this seems to be a matter of elementary logic. And of course, if you visit California or large parts of Southern Europe, for example, this is already having really serious physical effects. So an element of crisis is already with us. Of course, in other parts of the world, the developed world, let alone the developing world, Australia, unless you're blind as a bat, the Australians are already in climate change crisis. So it's already started. But look, I mean, as you can imagine, I also have my deeply pessimistic moments. It's one reason why I draw attention to South Asia and West Africa and places, where the climate change crisis is going to hit much, much sooner. And after all, if you put them together, these are areas with a third of the world's population, even before you get to China and the threat to China. But no, I mean, I also worry about that. But I quote in the book, as so many people do, Antonio Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. We have a duty as citizens, as educated citizens, and as citizens of our own countries, as well as citizens of the world, not to give in to despair. We just, we have a duty there. We have no right to surrender to despair. Just as we have no right when it comes to preserving democracy in our countries to throw up our hands and say, oh well, it's all over, there's nothing to be done. Speaking as a European, I do have certain kinds of, not personal memories, thank God, but collective memories of when people in Germany, for example, early 1930s, became so despairing of their political system, the Weimar democracy, that they basically said, oh, the hell with it, there's nothing to be done. Anyway, it couldn't get worse. It could get worse, and they shouldn't have given up. We shouldn't give up.
Thank you for that. So really quick before we move to our last question here, I was wondering what your thought was. So how does the use of nationalism to combat climate change impact corporations that operate on an international scale and have proven to be the world's worst polluters?
Yeah, now, I mean, firstly, of course, the role of corporations is true, but it can to some extent be exaggerated. They're the worst polluters. International Western corporations are the worst polluters in the West. Of course, China is the worst polluter in the world now by a considerable distance. In my view, and this is why the theme of sacrifice is so strong in my book, corporations operate within the international capitalist economy, as does China, of course, in which we are all participants. They produce things that we buy. They buy things or produce things in Asia. We then transfer our climate change emissions to Asian industry. But I mean, a central theme of the book, of the Green New Deal, and in advocating the Green New Deal, I refer back repeatedly to the new nationalism of Theodore Roosevelt, of course, extended in many ways then by his cousin Franklin in the 1930s, but precisely the need, as in these cases, as part of rebuilding national solidarity and re-strengthening democracy, but now also in the struggle against climate change, the need to bring in much stronger controls of these corporations. And of course, amongst other things, both to raise taxes, return to progressive taxation, but also to crack down really hard on money laundering, tax avoidance and tax evasion. That's a lawyer's. To me, as an ordinary citizen, there ain't much difference between those two categories, and they need to be brought back under control. But I should say here that I view this not as a socialist revolutionary program, but very much as the two Roosevelts saw it, or a long row, not just of social democrats, but of moderate conservatives in Europe in the past, essentially as part of an effort to save capitalism from itself. I think we've learned that whatever, the Washington consensus may have said for so many years, capitalism will not regulate itself. It just won't. Capitalism left to itself, becomes inevitably an unrestrained and destructive force. Then again, you can't abolish capitalism. Whatever Naomi Klein and people may say, if we wait to take climate change action until the abolition of capitalism, then it's not going to happen. When climate change action will not be taken. So I think what we need to do is go back, to the inspiration of the two Roosevelts and the Green New Deal, and acknowledge that in order to save capitalism from destroying itself, we need to reintroduce much more regulation, controls, direction and leadership by the state in the interests of the people as a whole. But in the interest of capitalism too. I mean, one part of the story of, of the New Deal and of the welfare state in Europe was that after the catastrophes of the first half of the 20th century, intelligent capitalists accepted and acknowledged this themselves, that, if you're going to preserve capitalism, it needs to be controlled, shaped, restrained in various ways.
I see. All right, so we have time for one last question here, and this is from Hannah. Hannah asks, what do you think the climate effects of the pandemic will be? Had it been handled better, do you think the negative effects, if any, could have been prevented?
Well, of course, I mean, it could have been handled far, far better. I mean, starting obviously with the Chinese in Wuhan. The Chinese afterwards did a tremendous job, of course, of controlling the epidemic within China, but obviously the local authorities in Wuhan stumbled very badly indeed at the very start. But after that, our state systems and societies were horribly unprepared and needed to introduce, much stronger restrictions much, much earlier. And that, of course, also required planning. I mean, it is, in many ways quite inexcusable that after, all these previous scares over SARS, over Ebola, that we didn't have a system of controls which was simply put in at once. And I should say, obviously the Trump administration was grossly at fault there, but Britain did even worse, and actually no European country except perhaps Germany and Denmark has done really well. It seems that our societies are not good at introducing these kinds of controls for good democratic reasons as well as bad ones. But certainly, I think that this is a real lesson in how we need to be prepared for, as they say, non-traditional security threats, which can do, once again, so much more damage to us. Of course, there's geopolitical rivalry between China and the USA, and I'm certainly not advocating American unilateral disarmament or abandoning genuine key allies like Japan. But the fact of the matter is, China does not want to destroy the United States or destroy the United States economy, if only because that would take the Chinese economy with it. Of course, there are elements of rivalry with Russia, but Russia does not, the Russian government does not wish to destroy the United States. It is trying to re-establish elements of influence in certain parts of the world along its borders, which, to be perfectly honest, well, two things I'd say. One, sorry, this is very much how traditionally America has sought to control, the USA has sought to control Central America. Like it or not, that's true, Secondly, if you look at the Middle East, where I now live, I'm not saying that Russian policy has been good. The Chinese, by the way, very sensibly have kept out of the region altogether until recently. But look at America's record over the past 30 years, and can it truly be argued that American hegemony in the Middle East has somehow represented good as opposed to evil, has brought stability, has brought progress, has no, and so let alone, I mean, has it brought anything good to the American people? Absolutely not. So once again, I think we need to refocus the attention of the American and other states as well on the interests of their citizens and the defense of the lives of their citizens. And once again, I mean, to end the point about nationalism, perhaps the American state in particular, because of this vision of itself as the bearer of democratic ideals for the whole world into the future, is particularly concerned with this question of preserving America, not just as a nation and a state, but also as a model for the long future. And even if we can get through the shorter future without suffering too much damage, unless we can limit climate change in the longer future, we have no future.
Very true. Well, any final words you want to leave us with before we conclude for the evening?
Just, I don't know, like everybody else, I suppose, work to try to get our state systems to do something serious about this. And also, I mean, if you really take climate change seriously, then prioritize it and don't try to load too many other agendas onto it. Climate change should come first.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. I want to thank you, Dr. Lieven, for being with us this evening. Well, for you, morning. We really appreciate you taking the time. If you enjoyed this event, you can find many more like it on our website, townhallseattle.org. We hope you'll consider making a donation, as your support will allow us to continue to provide events just like this one. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of Dr. Lieven's book, Climate Change in the Nation State, The Case for Nationalism in a Warming World, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase through our friends at Third Place Books here in Seattle. Finally, thank you again for being here. Have a great evening, everybody.